Tall Tales. The Nymph Symphony.
Chapters.
Chapter 17. Syndicate. After turn upon turn into the darkening madness of that mountain's main entrance shaft, we had only my glowing necklace to light and ferry our way forward. The walls around us were always closing in and narrowing before each new corridor gap, forcing us to squeeze and compress our bodies through single file as we pushed aside rocks and finally managed to move into the main tunnel halls. Kneeling and crawling through tight collapsed gaps in the path, only to be relieved by the giant growing labyrinth of tracks and cargo rails we saw upon our arrival inside the heart of the mine. The four of us were entering into one prime and seemingly endless cargo passageway, which branched out like an anthill of hidden side shafts, with rubies embedded in the walls like little red reflector panels that led the way forward. The mine was cleverly color-coded by gemstones and continuously forked and split into two as we encountered endless exits and wavy turn-off passageways. It was a whole cavernous maze, twisting erratically as it continued to drop and expand in both depth and size, making it supremely difficult for us to maintain our bearings with such little light as we tried to stay true to the prime red tunnel we were supposed to be following. Without obvious structure or pattern, those long quartz-covered corridors were dropping and rising like waves upon either side of us, elevating our already pounding hearts as we pressed on with an unsteady concoction of adventure and nervous suspense flooding our senses. I stumbled over small breakaway stones, as the four of us had to pair up and cling to one another just to keep our balance over the loose stones and crumbling rocks found underneath the railway sleepers we were following. We were at the mercy of an old frail map that vaguely showed the layout of this cavern's vast and intricate network. It took some time for me to adjust and use the map to coordinate our way through the black and blurry haze the place had become, carefully contrasting the track's natural railway curvature from other more recent intersecting tunnels that were not displayed on that scrunched and rudimentary cave map we had at our disposal. We surpassed smallish sapphire-embedded side shafts thinly excavated along the lower left side of the cavern's central railings. It took a great amount of effort in simply avoiding those vertical long rolling drop-off tunnels, as well as observing many phantom and directionless paths designed to appetize and mislead novice explorers, coaching amateurs away from the enriched mining areas that lured them deeper into the flooded treacherous lava pits described on this map's lowest volcano levels. This place was the very definition of a death trap, slowly swallowing and consuming visitors by confusing them with a plethora of interweaved mirroring tunnels. Even an experienced miner could easily fall prey to the never-ending pockets of the maze, to be lost down here forever if any miner's lantern were to expire before they could find their way back onto the main prime passageways. I was glad I had my pendant, an everlasting light to guide us through this darkness. It twinkled with a steady sparkle of light, radiating outwards and dimly illuminating the tunnels ahead, suddenly making me the most valuable member of my team. "Are you sure this is the right way to go?" Arlo asked as I navigated our way. I noticed he was shivering slightly as he leaned close towards me and my luminous pendant, failing to maintain the proud bravado of a soldier, even if he was completely unwilling to admit he was spooked by the strengthening darkness as he pushed closer and closer beside me. "No," I responded. "I've never been here before either," I reminded him. I could feel a strong resistance of drag, like bouts of air pressure, fluxing against my hand as it dangled next to his. I could tell he was on edge, nervously flickering ultrasonic sound in uncontrolled jittery angst, just as scared of beasts sleeping from the lurking shadows as I was. "Are you as scared as I am?" I asked him. "No," he sharply denied. "Not even slightly?" I pressed. Already aware he was, due to his scouting eyes and lack of reply, the man began straightening his slumping posture and lifting his chin up as he pulled his hand away from mine. "Well, if you were scared, that would be okay too," I reassured him. "You don't have to be fearless to be a good soldier, and no one here is going to think any less of you for it if you did," I added, once again trying to melt down his crippling pride. "I don't know actually, I might," Anara cut into tease, cheekily punting at her brother as he shoveled past him and me, taking the lead, using her keen sense of sound and echo to map her own way without the use of light and eyesight. "What about you, Oconee?" she then pried towards him invitingly. "Oh, of course," he bantered back to her, slipping past Arlo and me and taking Anara's offered hand. He was wearing special thermal specs he'd brought along in his backpack, which granted him a full radar of vision that freed him from the same idealistic fears and impairment me and the prince both timidly shared. "Just scream if you need us," he then mocked towards his best friend, waving his repaired plasma flare gun as he and Anera disappeared ahead into the darkness. That purple electric trail gleaming out of his backpack, waving like a tail as it dimmed and eventually disappeared. Arlo and I walked in silence for a good minute before we caught up to Akoni and Anera's trail, seeing them stop at the end of the tunnel as they inspected a thin passageway that blocked their way any further along the red path. It was a tight and treacherous corridor created from a recent cave-in, and yielding only a small running seam between two collapsed cave walls that had avalanched and fallen onto each other in order to meet in the middle. Akoni and Anera didn't bother waiting for us. They helped each other squeeze inside one by one and vanished from our sight altogether again, leaving Arlo and me behind as we stayed glued to the guide and wait for their safe reply from the other side. We stared blankly towards the map's twinkling gold ink while we waited, as if staring at it long enough might just cast some magical spell that would move the earth and offer us a safer alternative to squashing into the slim passageway crack we knew we were eventually going to have to enter. It was funny how a single little piece of scrap paper could become so vital to our survival, and yet how quickly it would have been discarded by the prince if he had entered the farmhouse alone. To me, the map was my contribution to the group, something that made me paramount towards completing our mission, of which was a really good feeling to have. "It's safe, come through," Anera's voice eventually echoed back to us. Following their words, Arlo helped me into the thin gap first. I felt claustrophobic and anxious, simply trying to avoid the jagged and slippery rocks within the gaps of boulders that lined the passageway, slithering slowly side by side as Arlo entered shortly after me, both of our shoulders practically squashing against one another, while my right and his left were left rubbing oil and grit off the crumbly, greasy coal walls we were shuffling sideways through. I decided it was a good time for a distraction, and time to try and quell the tension between Arlo and me. "Hey, Arlo," I whispered backwards to him, unable to turn my head around to actually see him as I said it. "Yeah, what?" he sharply answered, both of us still trying to slither through a crevice, which was no wider than half of my waistline. "Bats versus cats. Which giant wins?" I asked randomly, attempting to break the ice and use thought to take away the panic of feeling stuck in a wall beside him. I don't know. No idea," he said, too involved with his struggle of squeezing down the narrowing passageway to put much thought into it. "Why? What do you believe?" he eventually asked back. "I'm not too sure either. I guess logic says it would be cats because they're said to grow bigger," I stated. "Yeah, true. But bats fly, and they also stick together, so that's one hell of an advantage," he offered back, starting to give it some thought. "Yeah, although if they're both predators, how could cats grow any bigger than bats if bats weren't what those cats fed on?" I pondered. "I'm confused. How is any of this relevant exactly?" "Well, it isn't, but that's the point," I said. "I'd rather not think about where we are right now, nor where we're going." "Oh, it must be such a curse, never being able to turn off that big brain of yours," Arlo then said towards me playfully. "Are you mad at me for what I said back at the dinner table?" I then proceeded to ask him, already rehearsing a full apology in my head as I carefully slipped my way through the tightest gap so far, one I knew he was going to have trouble with, even if Akoni and his thick metal backpack managed to somehow find a way through it. He gave up a long delay before responding to me, making me wonder whether I was going to have to remind him about what happened. No, I don't. What part exactly?" he asked absent-mindedly, concentrating on keeping his crystal sword from getting constantly lodged between the rocks. The issue of how to get it through the gap without the pointy end stabbing into me on the other side. "You know, when I made a scene about bread," I reminded him, feeling embarrassed at the very recollection of it as I chose to continue moving and climb over one of the last tiny jagged steps before the clearing, the passageway widening out more comfortably as I slipped up and down a rock with a finesse I knew Arlo was going to be incapable of reproducing. Yeah, no, it's all cool," he said. "I mean, who doesn't love bread?" he humored, trying to lighten my mood. "I get that it's been a strange week for all of us," he then added as he struggled through the tight passageway segment I had cleared, both of us near the cave-in's very end. "And I guess I can relate to that right now," he finally concluded, sliding down and free triumphantly as he no longer needed to feel his way through the most constricting part of the slowly reopening corridor gap. Both of us relieved he didn't lose his temper and release airwaves capable of collapsing the rock tunnel all over again. And besides, if you said what you said because of the poor way I and my family treat you, then that's really our fault and not yours, right? He asked rhetorically, humbly flaunting that selfless inability he had to ever blame someone else for something that might happen to him in his life. One of the very admirable traits to his whole stubborn persona that made me fancy him the way that I did. I felt freed from the constricting guilt and anxiety that I had been clinging to since my whole dinner table outburst. "Thank you," was all I could shyly express to him about it as I helped pull him free from the final rocks of the gap still in his way, attempting to be modest but considerate nevertheless. As in actual fact, it did mean the world to me to have him say those words. I began dusting off my hands before patting myself down, allowing silence to descend again before approaching another subject. "So," I began, relentless at wiping away the grime from my own shoulders as I spoke. "You've had a pretty big week compared to most," I remarked with a scandalous grin and smile, referring to his proposal to Ebony. "Yeah, he flustered to say. "It just needed to be done," he said, looking around, semi-embarrassed as he tried to play it off while trying to work out where to go next. "Are you really sure this was the right way?" he asked again. Yes, yeah, this time I'm positive," I said, pointing up to the dim silhouette of his sister and best friend, who waved back to us from the small dark hillside wall climb straight above us. "The tracks go up now that it's broken," I added, stepping onto a large granite boulder, and with Arlo's help, placing my hand on his clean and less grotty shoulder plate as we began the vertical hike up towards Nara and Akoni, who were catching their breath way up above. "You know they say transformation is one step shy of transcendence," I riddled to him while we climbed up the steepest rocky slope. "So what?" "So what if the old legends about spiritual ascension are true? And Ebony is gifted enough to sprout butterfly wings and go live up in the Cloud City as a wisp for the rest of her days?" I meddled. "To be honest, I don't think she's exactly the mediation type," he added with a small laugh. "So yeah, that's a pretty mighty if," he mocked. "But please don't tell me you're not a believer in all that spiritual mumbo-jumbo. Stupid myths of flying angels that watch over us from their skyland above." "No, not particularly, but I like the sentiment. And I mean, there was a time long ago when many in the capital did used to believe in such nonsense. Pretty much up until your mother outlawed all spiritual practices. Yep, one of the only laws made that I actually happen to agree with. The townspeople don't need false idols, they need real ones. Which is why getting this crystal is worth us dying over," he stated, the sternness of his words bringing us both into a quiet discord as we kicked our legs and pulled ourselves up again and again, climbing up it like a ladder. "Okay, well, say for philosophy's sake, say that the myths were true and Ebony was able to take you away with her into the heavens. Would you go with her and leave the kingdom to someone else to rule?" I continued, interested to hear his response to such a crazy hypothetical. "Well, if it really is for philosophy's sake, then I would wish her great fortune and miss her deeply when I wave her goodbye. But no, not even if the sunspire breaks would I leave my kingdom behind. My place is here, down in the pits with wherever my kind reside," he answered. "Satisfied?" he then asked precariously back to me. "No, never." I quickly teased back, feigning disinterest in his unexpected response, unsure if I was humbly impressed or slightly disturbed over the prospect that he was to be a king who would rather rule hell than humbly serve in heaven. "Well, if you can't find enough fun from your own questions, then I guess it's my turn," he stated, pulling out his sword only to dig it deep into the cracks of the gravel as a resting post while he helped tug me up a difficult incline of the overhanging slope. "Say your rules were reversed as you were crowned queen for the rest of your days. What would you do with it?" he asked. It was a simple enough question, one I'd been asked by daydreaming maids countless times before, but for the prince, I had no definitive answer. I don't really know. Probably the same stuff as always, I guessed, just without the consequences of committing royal disobedience every time I did so. I then joked to him, pushing myself up further without his help. "So, you are where you want to be then?" he asked curiously. "Yeah, definitely," I replied, smiling back at him, our eyes locking. "And you?" I asked as he proceeded up the tricky part of the slope, checking the distance from the very top before moving upwards. The prince was working twice as hard to climb these roller coaster-like rails first each time, only to come back to push me up ahead, the two of us balancing on the ledge under a fuming heat radiating from the cliff face above. Due to elevation of this thickly insulated tunnel shaft and its obvious proximity to the next nearby lava trench. The effort of holding on becoming harder in our hands as it got hotter, the fear of slipping rising, despite how firmly stable our grip was against the rails. Humidity making our arms sweat while our hands and feet clung to the warm, smooth vertical ladder rails. Such humidity most likely signifying our close proximity to the natural metal forges of the central refinery our map said we were slowly heading towards. Yeah, same, he responded with a short but humble respect to the question. It's a shame you're going to be king then. Soon you won't be able to have all this kind of fun anymore, I joked. Oh, my heart bleeds for you, I then sniped to him sarcastically. Yeah, says who, he announced enthusiastically. A king can do what he wants, right? He said with a grin. Although speaking of danger, how much trouble are you going to be in this time around? Arlo inquired, changing the topic altogether. I'd rather not think about it, to be honest. I'm likely safer in this cave, then I'd be back at the castle. I chuckled, fighting both fear and fatigue as I said it. The conversation was most fun for me, but at the same time, it was also getting physically harder to contribute to. We climbed very quickly and managed to get very high very fast. Last blood was getting to our heads as we climbed the railway bars like military high ropes. We were very close to the peak of the ledge once we regained the steady sight of Anera and Akoni sitting by its peak, resting from their own arduous ascent as they waited for us to catch up. You've always been scared of my mother, haven't you? He asked, taking a step back down to hang beside me as I heaved myself up a little bit slower than him. Most people are scared of her, Arlo, I quietly confessed, getting more and more exhausted from the climb. And most people have a fair reason to be, he stated, placing his hand upon one of my elbows to help alleviate the pressures of the climb. But you don't. You're family to us. Nothing bad will happen to you so long as me and my sister are around, he pledged, using those giant muscular shoulders to pull himself up the next ladder with his one hand as he offered me his other. But you're not always around, are you? I said, refusing to take that hand, instead grabbing the next step by myself in a sense of personal pride. You know, you blame my mother for everything. When it's wrong of my sister to constantly put you in this kind of trouble, he stated, wiping sweat off his forehead as the heat and work finally started hitting him as much as it had been me. Yeah, but unlike your mother, it comes from a good place, I said, valiantly defending Anera and her choice to include me in her most recent escapades. Your sister only ever means well, and without her, I wouldn't have any of the things I'm grateful for having today, I then proudly said, looking down the ladder to the beautiful dress she bought me as it stuck to my skin, covered by black cold smudges and past tears. Arlo, when you do become king, I hope you're smart enough to trust and rely upon her for counsel, I announced as we reached the very bend of the tunnel's horizontal cliff edge, together taking a silent moment to breathe before regrouping. First to take Akoni's slippery hand as he leashed a small safety rope around our hands before physically trying to pull me over the final ledge of the bending incline. We're real close to the refinery, Akoni redundantly stated to us, helping the prince up next, eagerly ready to pursue the glimmering crystal diamonds all shimmering like streetlights downhill towards the red smog of the molten refinery somewhere just out in that distance. Arlo's sword was radiating brightly at his back, matching the crystals coloring the walls as it too took on a lava-orange kind of fluorescent shine. We all watched it glow from an orange to blood-red aura, reflecting in conjunction with the lights downhill, as if directing the way for us to follow. It really was as if the sword was alive and telling us through computation that it had finally found its home again. Quickly but quietly, we walked down from the cap of the steep hill towards the glare of the dome-based refinery centered on my map. Following the same former cargo line as before, our travel seemed less perilous the further we ventured, with the ground leveling out as we moved deeper and deeper into the crust of the mountainside's thick volcanic mantle level. Appearing silvery black, the tunnels had become much brighter, denser, and smoother. It seemed likely that more movement and maintenance had been performed on this side of the cavern. Despite having a map of this place, navigating through these tunnels was becoming infinitely more difficult as we started to lose our directions all over again, due to the constant division of diverting rails, forcing us to choose alternate doorways each time, each parallel tunnel looking just the same as the one we had just come out of. And so, being back at the front and having retaken on the role and burden of navigator, For a long time, I felt like the warden of an old abandoned prison as we walked down its unholy unhaunted walls, caught hearing the low-pitched wails of wraiths in the windless distance, and witnessing the subtle sharp turns of shadows as those vengeful ghosts of my imagination were angrily seeking retribution against me. I found it hard to ignore those irrational fears, but I knew I was much braver than I had been just a couple of days before. I had found in myself an abnormal yet reassuring confidence in my own abilities, and with it, a thriving yet surprising need to take on the scary challenges in front of me rather than seek refuge against them. As with that map back in my hand, I was once again the arbiter of our mission to find the next giant crystal diamond. The one who had to make all of the scary choices on behalf of my friends as I tried to correctly decipher all the twists and turns with the gold etchings of this scruffy and outdated paper map, warding us away from the maggot layers, poisonous mercury ponds, and other natural toxic areas spotted all across the map in written warning. We neared the obsidian pits in the middle of the map. All movements began leading towards the dome-shaped refinery one way or another, as with it, the sounds of quick scurries and other lurking activity were beginning to surpass simple imagination and warrant a real need for concern. Starting off so quiet and harmless, like rocks crumbling from the walls, it was getting harder to work out whether it was just our imagination or whether we were no longer alone in the cave. The pit of my stomach started to sink as we secretly descended into Midas's obvious factory hideout. Strangely so, we had succumbed to the darkness and honed our senses to accommodate the lack of sight. Thoughts and sounds, for one, seemed to echo and travel much further and deeper within us as we heard them, offering us greater wisdom and clarity to judge danger via the vibe of our own heartbeats. Typical scenarios that ordinarily ran through my head were being magnified by the silence of the tunnels and bringing those ghosts to life as we battled to keep calm. I was calculating escape paths, and funneling points were becoming almost second nature to me. Tactically speaking, I was getting used to being a creature within the darkness, gaining the mind of a warrior as I mentally explored the options around me, of which superficial sight might ordinarily limit me from ever considering. My field of expertise was noticeably growing, but I wondered at what extent would that battle readiness and smartness turn sickly. What do you call somebody who is ready to react to outcomes that might not ever happen? Smart, prepared, or crazy? It seemed down here I was just realizing how easy it was for someone's irrational fears to engulf their own personal judgment. A sad yet likely scenario that had befallen Midas, as he was always revered as a genius who eventually turned into a madman. I thought of how much damage this place could have done to him over so many years alone, allowing the demons in the dark to whisper to him, no different than how my shadows could build upwards like living statues and uprise against me, if I so much as accidentally started thinking about them doing so. Paranoia was getting the better of me, even if I wasn't showing it. I imagined horrible clawing beasts hidden within the darkness and scorpion pincers reaching for me. I thought of burrowing fanged millipedes blasting upwards from my feet as they tunneled their way up from underneath, springing up to attack us, unprovoked but always hungry. These fears clouded my thoughts, becoming more and more believable in my mind as time pressed on. I looked brave like all the others, but deep down I was trembling over many unseen moments of weakness. Points of pure fear that were making me halt every few steps forwards towards the unique diamond dig site we were searching for. I heard hissing whispers as we passed holes that led into tiny dead-end tracks, all paranoid delusions intensifying and elevating my already growing tension, while I and the others refrained from speech altogether, keeping silent just so we could hear and look for movement out there in the slowly brightening blindness. Loose crumbling rocks were echoing loudly as we unintentionally kicked them along the smooth track. My pendant was glowing like moonlight as it bounced off every clear glossy crystal and silver rail along our journey. It had become adamantly clear we were not following the same red ruby encrusted track that was clearly illustrated on our map. From left to right, minecarts were stuffed with boulders encrusted with unsorted gemstones. Like the rubies that were once in the walls, there were bits of everything, all discarded as if they were worthless. Not that I'm afraid, but let's just grab this crystal and get out of here already. Anera timidly whispered to me and the others from the very back of the pack, glancing left to right as if she could hear and see something. I agree, Arlo said with a similar tone of fear. We're not all mistresses of darkness, he quietly added towards me. Yes, because I'm having so much fun right now, I rebutted. I would give anything to be able to go invisible, I added while still edging forward, the others sticking close, almost like they knew something I didn't. You really think invisibility would be much help down here? Anera replied. Clearly nothing down here relies on eyesight, she explained, her hand gripping Akoni's left arm, squeezing it in dread. Avoiding the wavy heat vents of his silvery backpack as Akoni quietly began charging his pistol. You see them, don't you? Akoni asked her. What do you see? Said Arlo bluntly in stagger, the corners and side tunnels still too dark to see into. Yes, and I don't want to, she said, still gripping his arm. They're everywhere, guys, Akoni exclaimed in a cautious whisper, raising alarm as we all stopped to stand still upon its very mention. Right now? Arlo staggered to ask, carefully and slowly drawing his sword defensively. Yes, Anera responded. They're just looking at us, though, she described, sensing their slow and nimble movements throughout the countless cavernous side holes, movements more quiet and stealthy than our whispers. What are? I quietly asked. Gnolls? Arlo speculated, his eyes fixed towards the tunnel's floor, as if trying to feel for his environment with the same sixth sense Anera seemed to possess. I don't know why they aren't attacking us, Akoni said. Because they're not gnolls, Anera replied. They're just small, frail nymphs, she concluded, helping ease our fears. Maybe that's all they ever were, I was first to theorize out loud. Hungry weaklings in shrouded capes, using scary outfits to make us run instead of fight for our food. I can't imagine they get a great deal of nourishment in a place like this. I then added, finally looking and spotting one of those scrawny figures in their beady-eyed mining goggles as we reached the opening corridor that led into bright and luminous gold forges. I created a small army of shadow statue soldiers, conjuring them from every corner of shade beside me. The frail nymphs squealed and cowered once I did it, making all of us realize there were nothing for us to be scared of. Although large in number and holding old rusty mining claws and iron picks, which could be portrayed as fierce weapons to the untrained eye, it seemed like they could barely lift these tools with their own weak arms, much like they required all kinds of mechanical aid to help elevate their weaker or damaged limbs. Hysterically so, they were stopping their obsidian stone labors to stare at us in terror, squirming among each other as a whole crowded chamber of them began bumping into one another in an effort to try and get out into the refinery dome and away from us before we got too close to them. It was then that I realized most of them were very old, and were simply rushing forward to pick up the little children they were babysitting before pacing away to find safety in the dome up ahead.